Over the past several years, there has been a significant increase in protests in Latin America. We have seen protests in support of bringing down the government of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2014 and 2015 and into 2016. We have seen protests in Venezuela in recent years against the government of against the Maduro government, undertaken to support democratization. In the last 6 months, though, beginning in October, we've seen a spate of protests in Chile, Bolivia, and Colombia. In Bolivia, the protests centered around the elections that eventually caused Evo Morales to leave office. In Chile, protests began on October 7th over a small hike in metro fares. They were led by high school students in that country, but they rapidly escalated over issues of inequality and the cost of living. Over the course of October, leading to looting and violence between public safety officers and protesters, as well as damage to the metro system. The president, Sebastián Piñera, declared an emergency in late October. Protests intensified during this period, leading to thousands of injured and arrested. University entrance exams were recently disrupted. And the government has called a plebiscite in April to discuss, to give citizens the opportunity to vote on whether to call a new constitutional convention. Protests are also erupted in Colombia in November. Over several issues, including corruption, rumored austerity policies on the part of the government of Iván Duque, and the dissatisfaction with the adherence of the Duque government to the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC. The events unfolded principally between the 21st and 23rd of November, with confrontations between security forces and protesters, looting, and one death. There have also been protests around issues related to violence in Mexico. Unfortunately, one of our presenters for today, Patricio Navia, a professor at New York University, woke up sick with a fever and is unable to attend the meeting today. Patricio is an expert on Chile, and I'm disappointed that he was unable to be here, but there's nothing we can do about health issues, unfortunately. We do have here today, though, Janice Gallagher. She is a professor in political science at Rutgers University in Newark. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs at Brown University. She holds a doctorate in government from Cornell University and a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College. She conducted more than 2 years of field work in Mexico and Colombia, and previously worked as a human rights activist in Colombia. Gallagher's dissertation, Tipping the Scales of Justice, the Role of Citizen Action and Strengthening the Rule of Law in Colombia, focused on organized citizen action and institutional pressure in affecting the provision of justice in Mexico and Colombia, as part of a larger project that she is engaged in on state civil society relations there. So because of the change in the composition of the panel, we're going to focus principally on Colombia, as well as other issues that we will discuss related to protests more broadly, and Janice's work on protests in Mexico. Without further ado, Janice.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being up so early. I'm very impressed with the turnout. That's my sense that this is how it goes here. Well, I'm impressed to see everybody up so early. So again, we are sorry that Patricio couldn't be here, but I hope we can, I think we'll still have an interesting conversation today. So today I'm going to talk about protests in Colombia, which we've really been seeing since November of 2019, as Devlin said, with we had kind of an echo protest in January, but let me talk first about what's happening, how we should understand the kind of the proximate causes, and then I'll do kind of a quick jaunt through Colombian history in just a couple minutes, because I think to really understand kind of in more profoundly what's happening, we really, of course, have to look historically and situate what's happening against the peace process, and also against the previous peace negotiations. So, what has been happening? Again, since November 21st, we had the largest protests in Colombia, at least since the 1970s, right? So in Colombia, we have a country which is often on the streets, but not in these numbers, right? There's 200,000 people on the streets on November 21st. So again, what does this look like? This is a cacerolazo. So when we have a cacerolazo, we have people banging on pots and pans. So Bogota's streets were not only full of protesters, but full of kind of a cacophony of sounds. These were largely nonviolent protests. Despite the fact that they were largely nonviolent protests, we had a pretty militarized response, right? The government's first instinct in terms of responding to these was to call the ESMAD, which is the riot police, which if anybody's been in Bogota, and you see the guys kind of in full riot gear. So full riot gear, police were out on the streets in force. On the third day of the protest, we had an 18-year-old student who was killed. So Dylan Cruz was killed on the third day of the protest by basically a rubber bullet, but it's actually like a beanbag bullet stuffed with lead. So it's a little more scary than a rubber bullet. He was, by all intents and purposes, not directly confronting the police at the time, but was peacefully protesting at the time that he was killed. In response to his death, as you might expect, protests got bigger, they got louder. The government, the Duque government, who's the president of Colombia, imposed the first curfew that Colombia's had in 42 years. So at first, the first response again was to repress, was to tell people to go home, was to confront nonviolent protesters in a militarized way in public spaces, and then to say, well, maybe we should dialogue, right? So maybe this isn't working. Kind of being persuaded with the persistence of the protest that maybe dialogue is the right thing to do. So trying to walk it back a little bit, but with really nothing concrete, at least in the beginning, right? In terms of what's happened in 22, so Colombia takes its breaks seriously. There was a Christmas kind of slowdown. All of government offices closed. Many people go back to, it's a kind of time focused on family. So that, I think, in many ways really calmed what was happening. January 21st, we had a remobilization. I couldn't get great numbers, but it was a lot less, right? So it hasn't felt like the same kind of hyper-mobilization that we saw on November 21st. So we have kind of an echo wave. So that's more or less the kind of basics of what's happened. Okay, so what are the proximate causes? What kind of immediately spurred this massive mobilization? So these strikes were first called in October of 2019. There's rumors of pension cuts. This is part of the neoliberal package that Desmond mentioned. There's rumors of cuts to education. And again, there's kind of ongoing fallout in Colombia over, just like we see in many Latin American countries at this time, over corruption, especially with ties to Odebrecht. And we also have, so those two things, right? But also, right, this is happening amidst unprecedented attacks on indigenous communities and human rights defenders, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And also, again, why we're here today, right? Amidst protests in other Latin American countries, right? So there's this feeling, Doug McAdam, who's a social movement scholar, calls it, like there's this feeling that comes, that makes you feel like changes in the air, right? It makes you cognitive liberation. It's this feeling that it is time that something could be happening, right? We think about the 1960s and the US as people saying, I'm going to the streets because I believe in the change that I'm advocating for, but also because it seems like something's in the air. It feels like something could give, right? Arlene Ticker, who's a pretty well-known, who's a well-known Colombian political scientist and a friend, summed it up like this. The protests quickly expanded into something much wider, attracting not only students and workers, but Colombians of all stripes, concerned about the poor health system, inadequate pensions, violence, inequality, corruption, and other issues. So kind of a generalized a generalized feeling of discontent. So what have been the articulated demands? And I think the question is, who is articulating these demands? It's been a group of protesters. Kind of the basic demands are more money for public education, higher wages, more job stability, subsidized pension, better health care, the implementation of the peace accords. And then I think this is, I was doing a bunch of reading for today. Time magazine, in some ways, I think is parroting the diversity of the demands. They said the environmental groups were marching to demand the protection of grasslands and the prohibition of fracking in the country, while animal rights groups were protesting to ban shark hunting. I think that's going a little far, but I think this idea that the protests are a catch-all for discontent in Colombia isn't wrong. But I think to kind of understand the protest as a list of well-articulated demands pretty much misses the point, right? I think this is really capturing a larger feeling of discontent. It is a leaderless movement, which I think we should probably talk more about in the Q&A. What does it mean? That a lot of these movements are groundswells, right? These are not people, social movement, kind of long-time social movement actors testing out different framing of the movement and seeing what resonates and building a movement that has kind of deep roots in different organizations that all have kind of physical locations. This is really a groundswell. Social media is a big part of how people are hearing about what's going on, and that's bringing them to the street, right? One protester, which I think captured it well, said, "Colombia is tired of injustice, bad governance, and social inequality. Colombia is our life, our home, and we're ruining it." I think that's a better summation of what these protests are about than the particular demands, right? So there's kind of a feeling that this turn towards neoliberalism that Duque represents is going the wrong way, a feeling that the country's going in the wrong direction. But in terms of kind of specific demands that have detailed kind of ABC and specific kind of drafted legislation tied to them, that's not what we're talking about. So let's talk now. We're not kind of should be going to ending about the underlying causes. So this could be a course. We could do this in 3 hours. I'll take about, 5 minutes or something. So I think in order to understand what's happening, we really have to kind of situate this within, of course, within the end of what I would call Colombia's civil war. There's still debate after all these years about whether it's a civil war or not. But I think, so I just to kind of give my background. I lived in Colombia from 2006 to 2008. I lived and worked in Bogota. I worked in most of the major cities, and I also worked in an area which was disputed territory between the FARC and the paramilitaries and a peace community on the Panamanian border. I think Colombians are profound to me. So my reading on, and I also went back for field work in 2014, and I was there in October of this year as well. Colombians, I think, are profoundly sick of the violence that comes with war, but not only that, with the olas de violencia, the waves of violence and negotiation, right? So since the 60s, and really we're talking about since the 80s, we've had these waves of trying to end the conflict. So essentially it goes, things are really bad, we're going to negotiate. We think by negotiating that we're actually going to put a stop to this. Okay, that doesn't work, well then the right-wing government comes in, mano dura, and uses repressive policies to squash social protest, and hopefully to squash, in their eyes, hopefully to squash the FARC and the other leftist groups. Just to kind of, if you've heard, some of us, I would assume, know lots about Colombia, other of us not as much. Kind of just to bookmark a couple important highlights and lowlights of those waves. In the late 80s and early 90s, we had a peace process where the FARC was persuaded to come out of the mountains and form their own political party, which for anybody following the peace process, that's exactly what we're doing now, right? That political party was called the Unión Patriótica, the Patriotic Union, and they fielded about 3,000 candidates for local and national offices. Essentially, there was a political genocide against those candidates. All 3,000 of them were killed, right? So there's an amazing book about it called Walking Ghosts, which is a reporter following around the presidential candidate who knows is going to be assassinated, right? So it was this period of people saying, okay, so the way forward is to finally make space for the FARC to participate in the political process, and Colombia's kind of national dynamic showed that was not going to happen, that was not going to be possible. I think we can't understand what's happening today without going back to that time. The last time we really tried to integrate the FARC into the national political context was then, and that's what happened, right? So we kind of go through that period. I'll skip to the 2000s. So 2002 to 2010, Álvaro Uribe is the president, a classic mano dura president. Up until recently, he was still the most popular politician in Colombia, incredibly called the shots. Duque is largely seen, or was largely seen, as his puppet, or his political ally, disciple, and also to some extent his puppet. He, together with the US under Plan Colombia, took unprecedented action against the FARC, weakened them credibly, and then he thought that that Santos would come in and kind of continue his policies. Santos made a turn towards the negotiation side of things, came in, makes it clear that he wants to end the conflict. That's what he wants his crowning achievement to be. He works towards it. We have all of Colombian society, I think, maybe I'm overstating it a little bit, but really from 2010 to 2018, we have intense negotiations, intense peace process negotiations. They're happening in Havana. The FARC has a contingent in Cuba doing the negotiations. The government has a contingent. And for me, in Colombia during that time, most people knew what part of the negotiations they were in. They knew if they were negotiating the World Peace Accord. They knew if they were talking about victim rights. They knew if they were talking about transitional justice. It was a time where the society really gave itself over to this hope that if we plan really carefully, we bring in the international community, we join together, we talk to each other, we grapple with what it would really mean to forgive each other. We grapple with what it would mean to address the underlying conditions of violence. We grapple with what it would mean to have land reform, right? To guarantee jobs and resources to the demobilizing FARC, right? It was a time when kind of the big ideas and the root causes of what was wrong in Colombia were on the table. So I think going towards 2016, and the international community gets roped into it too, right? So before Santos, it's late, but they finally have this beautiful agreement. I don't know how many pages it is. It's a lot. I had my class read the whole thing. It's like really big, like 300 pages. I don't know, somebody probably knows. But it's really long, it's really detailed. It's beautiful in a lot of ways. It's very, in its detail and its level of intentionality, and not just thinking about what these policies look like, but how to implement them, how to monitor their implementation. Great. And Santos says, okay, I want to show that we have the legitimacy of the entire country behind us. I'm going to put this up for a vote. I don't need to, right? But I'm going to put this up for a vote. He puts it up for a vote, and it rains a lot that day. And he's kind of arrogant about how he's kind of arrogant about how the vote's going to go, and he loses, right? By 0.7%, I believe. Essentially, people in rural areas came out in really low numbers, partially because of the weather, partially because of other things. And by very narrow margin, the plebiscite is voted down. So this kind of moment of excitement that we're kind of cruising towards a really different time in Colombia, that feeling evaporates. So the Peace Prize too, Santos gets the Nobel Peace Prize. There's this feeling like, okay, we think we're heading towards brighter times, but it's not to be. So what's happening post-2016? Quickly, right? So we have the no vote. We have, I shouldn't say ELN bombing. We have the ELN, which was the second largest leftist insurgent organization in the country, has stepped up its recruitment, stepped up its violence to some extent. We have Duque having the lowest approval ratings of his presidency. I think they're around 26% now. And again, we have the non-enforcement of the accords. So, and so 2018, Duque is elected, right? So he's elected really as a pushback against the peace accords, right? He's not the candidate Santos wanted, and his election signals the disillusionment of Colombia, I think, with a certain sector of the Colombian population with the peace accords, right? So he's elected essentially to take a lot of the oomph out of the peace accords. And probably the major sticking points, that we can talk more about this, are a lot of people being really resentful that the FARC, who, if you're in Bogota or in Medellin, you remember the times when the FARC was kidnapping your neighbors or making it dangerous for your kids to go to school because they were engaged in urban bombings, right? The idea that the people that did those things are now guaranteed jobs, reintegration in society, a certain number of allotted political posts, a lot of people found that repugnant. There was also a lot of, I don't know what's the, red baiting, but in the form of LGBTQ issues. So there was a lot of talk about the peace accords empowering the LGBTQ community, which I won't go into, but essentially like red baiting in terms of saying that that was a major focus of the peace accord, which I don't think it was. So all of those things, we kind of have this letdown of a lot of people who thought 2016 was the beginning of a new era, and in fact, it's not. One thing I want to kind of go into a little bit, I started putting this together in 2016, a list of the action alerts of what was being sent out to the international community in terms of threats against human rights defenders and indigenous leaders. So this is, again, this is the area that I worked in. I worked in this community. You can't see this on purpose, right? Because the number of, the amount of violence against human rights defenders and indigenous groups has grown, I wouldn't say exponentially, but has grown hugely since 2016. In 2019, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights documented 108 killings of human rights defenders, and that's an increase of almost 50% in 2019 compared to 2018. I think we can talk again more about the causes of that. I think one cause is that you never, nor in the peace accords, nor with the law of justice and peace, which was supposed to provide for paramilitary demobilization, but actually just enabled them to operate under another name and kind of guaranteed that they wouldn't be prosecuted. So the paramilitaries have been responsible for the vast majority of human rights abuses during the conflict. About 80% of them, they essentially exist now without opposition, right? So I think the fact that you have paramilitary structure intact at the same time that you have a lack of a credible threat of reprisal. The FARC were the target of the paramilitary attacks, and now that the FARC have demobilized, the people who were standing in the way of the people that the paramilitaries are aligned with, which is mining interests or palm oil or the banana industry or different politicians who are making money off of the way that the current economy works. They had now have replaced the FARC as essentially legitimate targets for the paramilitaries, right? So I think, and now you don't have an armed group saying if you commit violence against us, there will be repercussions. So I think in some ways it's pretty unsurprising. A lot of us were talking in 2016, seeing everybody very excited with really high worries, right? This is in some ways, without a rigorous implementation of the peace accords, it's not surprising that a lot of these things are happening. Okay, so going back just to say why protest, why now? With everything I just said, right? It might seem counterintuitive that to protest right now is safer than it was previously in Colombia, but it is, right? So during the time of Uribe, anybody who said human rights, that they were a human rights defender, was accused of being a guerrilla, and that meant you were a legitimate target of state forces, right? So there was a criminalization of protest. There is some criminalization of protest now, but it was worse, right? So the fact that you were any protest linked you to an illegal armed group, but now that an illegal armed group is gone, does mean that in many ways there's more space for protest. And I think that's what a lot of people understand as the causes. For me, I think this feeling, I think that explains some of it, but I think it's more about disappointment. I think people are saying, the war is finally over. We've had 50 years where all we could talk about in all of our public spaces and our legislation, in our politics and our social movements was the war. Now we don't have that. So we finally get to talk about what's really going on in society. And look, we have this amazing, amazing accord, we have this amazing agreement that addresses the underlying problems of what's happening in Colombia. And it's not being implemented. We see the same, so people are seeing these same structural causes that they know have mapped into all of this suffering, all of this violence. They're seeing those same conditions not being addressed. And they're seeing Duque kind of in a lukewarm way go back, and his only answer is the same neoliberal reforms that have been tried before and that have led into this cycle of violence and negotiation. They don't want, I think Colombians are so sick of feeling like, okay, we've just come through another cycle, and they're seeing the violence kind of ticking up, and they're really scared that this is just another, that even we thought the peace accords were the end of this cycle, but in fact, it's just another step, and it spirals. So I think, for me, that's how I understand what's going on today. Thank you so much.
So, how would you characterize the protesters? Who are the protesters who are turning out in Colombia?
So there's kind of the usual suspects, right? Which are, so it's the student protesters. I also so I lived in downtown Bogota, and I also lived next to the National University when I was there at different times. And I remember kind of once going out, there was a big protest. People were lobbing papas, which are homemade bombs, between the ESMAD and the students, and I was like, oh my God, this seems like a really big deal, what's happening? And they were like, it's the 40th anniversary of Che's coming to Bogota. It's just like, there's a certain level of protest which is pretty normal, in which you have kind of student protesters joining with kind of some progressive social movement people. I think what made this different is you had everyday Bogotanos, so people who work in state government, people who are frustrated by the Transmilenio, which is essentially Colombia's version of the metro, right? People who are frustrated about the metro, environmentalists, kind of anybody living in Bogota who's frustrated with how things are going, came out. I should say, to interrupt myself, one thing I had on the slide but I didn't say. In October of this year, right before these protests happened, just to kind of get an idea of kind of the political climate, Claudia Lopezs was elected. Claudia Lopezs ran in a field, I was there for the election, so I should know. I think there were 4 or 5 candidates, and she was the most progressive of all of the candidates, and she won, right? So I think it was really unsuspected that she would win. She actually has a PhD in political science from the U.S. She is the first lesbian mayor in all of Latin America to be elected. So just kind of, and has declared herself in solidarity with the protesters. So kind of Bogota was feeling like we need a change. We want to embrace something really different. So yes, it's the students. Yes, it's the unions. But I think it's kind of like the people who haven't been involved in social movements, who aren't kind of in those peer networks necessarily, coming out to the streets for the first time, a lot of them. They've seen these protests over the years. They're very familiar with what they entail, but they're choosing to join them for the first time, I think. I should say, I think that they're happening in the center of Bogota. If anybody's been to Bogota, it's a long, thin city, which is very segregated along class lines. So we have poor people living like an hour or two south of the center of the city. I think you had some involvement from people from the poorer communities, but there were a lot of middle class people who live and work in downtown Bogota coming out as well. So it's a multi-class, kind of multi-class coalition in ways that are somewhat surprising, right? A lot of times we have the protests kind of pigeonholed, because Colombia is a highly unequal society, but we had participation from the different class sectors.
So I do notice a number of people arrived since the panel began. I just wanted to let you know that one of our other panelists, Patricia Navia, was ill and couldn't make it, so we have Professor Gallagher here today. So I wanted to follow up a little bit on Claudia Lopez's election.
Yeah.
Do you think that her election was in particular inspiring to people to protest? The idea that for the first time, or not the first time, but for one of a handful of times, you've had a leftist mayor in Bogota being elected.
I think there was a yes we can feeling, right? The feeling was, Claudia, it was up until the day of the election, it was not thought that she would win, right? She was at 23% and got a plurality of votes, I think, with over 35. So she really jumped in the last minute. So I think there was this feeling of this progressive side of Bogota can take power, right? And so less, I'd say, anything that she did, but rather this feeling of we are a silent plurality, maybe not a silent majority, but there's a lot of us who see that things are going wrong, that want to kind of draw a line in the sand and prevent us from regressing down this well-trodden path of kind of half-baked and very moderate reforms. It's time to try something different. It's time to do a paro nacional. It's a strike, right? It's a national strike. People are not going to work. They're shutting down businesses. They're shutting down universities. It's not just kind of clogging the streets. So I think that the fact that you have this feeling that we want to draw a line, we want to do something so that we prevent this cycle happening, I think that fed into it and was kind of we think of it as a primary victory, right? So it's kind of a sign that better things were to come for the people who are thinking that way.
One question that I had is about the protests in other cities, right? So Bogota's protests actually were quite vigorous and did sort of roll over into some violence. Whereas, say, the protests in Medellin, while there were vigorous protests and lots of people in the street, they didn't become violent, right? They didn't become quite as contentious. I'm wondering why you think that might have happened, right? Why Bogota's protests were more confrontational, perhaps, than those in other large cities?
I think we can explain it in a couple of ways. So first of all, I think there were at least 3 deaths, right? So there were deaths in other cities, I should say, and I don't know the details of them, but there were definitely deaths in other cities. But I think, so again, with the usual suspects in Bogota, there is a fairly well-organized and well-established anarchist community who will go into protests in Bogota, and their purpose for being there is to turn them more confrontational. And you don't have a similarly kind of established group in most of the other major cities. You don't have that in Cali, you don't have that in Medellin. So I think the fact that you have kind of like professional, semi-professional protesters in Bogota who are really there, that's their specialty. So they go in capuchados, they go with masks on, and there's often a lot of conflict between the protest organizers who want it to be kind of a family-friendly affair, and the encapuchados, the anarchists essentially, who will go there and use the fact that you have all these people together for their own purposes, which is they're anarchists, right? They want that they believe that creating chaos is going to benefit them. I was at a protest. I was when Bush was president, so it was a long time ago, but it was kind of families there. It was kind of a nice Sunday affair. People were like selling snow cones, and people were, their kids were there. And there were probably, a couple thousand people. And then just like that, there was kind of like a coordinated entrance of the anarchists who started throwing rocks at the ESMAD, at the riot police who were there. And immediately we were tear gassed, and it totally changed, right? So immediately people were fleeing. The anarchists were breaking the glass along the main thoroughfare. People were hiding in restaurants. There was property damage. So kind of it showed me how quickly a nonviolent protest can be changed. The very nature of it, the nature of its interaction with the state, and we've seen this in Mexico too. After the Ayotzinapa protests, when you had hundreds of thousands of people in the Zócalo, there's even kind of, I don't think it's too conspiracy theorist or to say that, especially in Mexico, there's a lot of accusations that the government often plants anarchists within the group because it benefits them in terms of their political narrative to say that the protesters were violent. I don't hear that as much in Colombia, but I'm sure that people also say that. So I think, I think that's, to me, Bogota has because Colombia is a pretty centralized country, right? So in order to make change, everybody knows that Bogota is where you have to apply pressure, especially when I compare it to Mexico, where I also do work. So that is the focal point of protests in the country. So in terms of having an articulated violent movement, it makes sense that that's in Bogota much more than it is in other places. I should say, I think the place that is suffering most, has been suffering most from the conflict, and continues to suffer most, is the kind of Cali, Buenaventura, and Chocó, which are largely Afro-Colombian on the west coast of Colombia. You don't have as many protests there, but you also have you have gnawing poverty, you have kind of I wouldn't even call it a low level of violence, a pretty high level of sustained violence, and so you don't have the sign of, so Bogota is the industrial center of the country. It is during Uribe's time, he essentially put a military cordon around Bogota, so you'd be in Bogota and you could forget that you were in a country at war. You could not forget that if you were in, you could forget that if you were in Bogota, and you forget that if you were in Medellin. And those were Uribe's core supporters. They are the whiter, richer, more privileged parts of the country, right? And they were essentially isolated from violence, from the violence to a large extent, which is part of why Uribe was so popular. In the meantime, you had the people in the kind of the smaller cities, and especially in the poorer communities and in Afro-Colombian communities, really suffering the brunt of the war and of the militarization strategies. So those places, sure, you don't have kind of people being killed on the streets. You also have people that are have been living in a really different reality. So a kind of low level forms of conflict and organizing have been happening throughout this time. So I think I don't, I'm a social movement scholar, but there's movements happening in those places, but the political context is just really, really different.
So I wanted to follow up on that a little bit, which is we've seen these intense protests in major cities, right, concentrated in Bogota for reasons that you outlined. But during this period, especially when there's been, killings of many rural civic leaders, we haven't seen the same types of protests erupt in rural areas. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on perhaps a little bit about the lack of rural protests in this context.
Yeah, I think so. Rural protests, I think, is in some ways like it's not. It doesn't really make sense, right? So if you're in a rural area and you're protesting, there's not a lot of people that can come out to join you. There's not a lot of government officials to listen to you. You're going to be like walking down a rural road, right? Like, what do you like? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. I lived in a rural area. I lived in when I was doing human rights work, I lived with a self-described peace community, so a community that had declared itself a armed actor-free zone, right? So they had prohibited the police, the military, the paramilitaries, or the FARC from coming in, because essentially they said if there's armed actors around, we know that where the civilians will be caught in the crossfire. So they were about 1,000 farmers. They organized themselves and kind of had a cordon around themselves and declared themselves a violence-free zone, and basically just said we want to be left alone to grow our crops. They were in a really kind of strategically positioned area. So yeah, that doesn't look like cacerolazo. It doesn't look like banging your pots and pans on the streets. But I would say that's it's an incredibly powerful form of protest. Just to say in response that it's a pretty famous case actually. It's called the Peace Community of San Jose de Apartado. They have cases in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. As a response to wanting to the actions that they took, there were about 1,000 people originally. In the first 100 days of their existence, 100 people were killed, right? So this is like early 2000s. So after that, they invited in the international community, the UN, human rights observers, to try to kind of get out the word of what they were trying to do. And they've been able to maintain their work because essentially of international visibility. So yes, they did marches every 6 months to the center of town to kind of protest the ongoing violence. But it looks really different than the urban protest, and it doesn't get the kind of press. It doesn't get us to have a forum about it. But these kind of low levels of organizing are happening in different communities in Colombia. I think there's a lot of great academic work because it doesn't make the press often, but these kind of citizen-led responses, which are often, having a community center in Cali or having caravans of people going in rural areas, talking to each other about how do you resist, how do you figure out how to make your living amidst the violence, right? What do you do in response to crop eradication? What are local forms of governments that are working now that the FARC is pulling out? Those kind of citizen to citizen or small group to small group conversations are happening. I think they're less visible, but they're fascinating, and I think would be kind of to really understand what's going on, we need to be talking about those smaller citizen-led rural initiatives.
Well, yeah, in southern Colombia, around in Putumayo, there's a long history of cocaleros protests, right, and strikes.
Right.
And there were some, and in 2019, there were some strikes in Caquetá, especially by indigenous communities. And I guess the point I'm trying to push you on here a little bit is you like we didn't see these types of rural strikes erupt in a coordinated fashion with what was going on in Bogota. This really did seem like a very urban-focused set of movements that didn't find a way of spreading or connecting out to people who were dissatisfied with the state of the peace process in rural zones.
But I think, so I'd push back on you. I don't think what we're seeing in Bogota is a movement, right? This is not a movement-led protest. This is a kind of, in social movement language, this is a contentious episode, right? This is people going onto the streets, people are angry, but movements have to draw upon pre-existing networks, right? So if you had, so for example, the Afrodes, which is the largest Afro-Colombian organization in the country, or I'm going to screw it up, so I'm not going to say it, but I can't remember the name of the largest indigenous organizing committee. All of those organizations are based in Bogota, but they're all coalition organizations. They have 200 to 400 organizations that are part of their directorate, right? So if this had been a movement-led organization, you would have seen that. Right, because Colombia is incredibly well organized and incredibly well networked. You have the campesinos have their organization, the Afro-Colombians do, the indigenous groups do. So if you can have that kind of national mobilization, but it's smaller, right, because it's relying on these networks that don't have kind of penetration into all parts of Colombian society. What you had in Bogota is a collective frustration about everything that's happening, right? This feeling that the whole society is going down the tubes, so we have to take to the streets and put a stop to what's happening, right? So I think that's really, really different. The other thing I'll say is, I think you don't have that happening in rural areas because people are starting to be really scared again, right? In Colombia, there is a credible and well-founded fear that si levantas la voz, if you raise your voice, you are going to receive threats, right? If you look at the history of social movement organizing, Colombia is still the most dangerous place to be an activist and a union organizer in the world, right? So you don't have this same idea that things have changed and it's going to be safer. Does not feel true, especially in areas that were controlled by the FARC, right? So we don't, because again, you don't have the FARC kind of silently at least having your back. So I think in the rural areas, people are really scared. So in the community that I worked with, we used to see groups of 5 to 20 paramilitaries. Last year, there was a group of 3,000 paramilitaries seen. They were having kind of a big conference, and they are feeling empowered to operate in open air, right? So I think the security situation in a lot of the rural areas where you would think they would come out, and where just to say, those people voted yes to the peace accords, right? They are the people most directly affected by the violence, and they want it to end. They're not coming out, and I wouldn't come out if I was them either, right? It's not, the organizing environment has proved to be violent, and there's no reason that they should think it isn't, especially with the failure to implement the peace accords.
Okay, and thank you. How would you characterize the Duque government's response to the protests, especially in Bogota, and how did that perhaps shift the course of the protests?
So I think I was there in October, and people, I would be remiss if I didn't quote, everybody I talked to was just like inepto y estúpido. Like, people just think he is not capable, right? So people might not agree with Uribe, but they don't think he's dumb and inept. People really think Duque is just, really, so more than anything else, is just not capable of responding in a coordinated way. So he very clearly flip-flopped, kind of first going towards the easy go-to for right-wing administrations in Colombia, which is to criminalize protest, these curfews, again, to the violence and that resulted in the death of that student. So that spurred people in Colombia recognize that very well, right? They know that that's what right-wing repression looks like, and it was a spark, right? So I think that sparked more people coming to the streets. And again, I would say it's complicated, but I think in Bogota, there has long been this feeling like we have passed this time when we're okay with putting up with bombings. We are not going to be cowed. We're not going to be scared. The fact that you have a curfew is not going to deter us. We feel kind of empowered enough, and things have been gotten good enough that we think it's our right to live in a peaceful society where things are getting better, and we're angry that you are too inept to make that happen. I think since then he's backed down again, and he said that no, we should have these dialogues for peace. But they are largely seen as, I think, empty and ill-defined. He hasn't promised concrete reforms. He's still kind of going back and forth between, he's still essentially trying to criminalize and paint the protesters as not credible, as not having legitimate demands, as being criminal elements, implying that they're kind of old tricks, right? Implying that anybody who speaks against them in some ways are linked to the insurgency still. So I think his response has been disheartening. But I think if he had stayed with Mano Dura, we would still see higher levels of mobilization. I think it has effectively taken the wind out of the sails. What I'm scared about, I think if Colombia becomes apathetic, I think you do enter into, then I don't know how we don't slide into another cycle, right? I think the failure these protests show that there is a political cost to not implementing the peace accords, and that needed to be heard. That point needed to be made, I think. So if we all assume that we want a society not at war, Duque's election was taking a huge amount of the kind of political momentum out of implementing the peace accords. So you needed something to push it. I'm a little worried that just Duque saying, okay, we should go talk again, right? We should have there be dialogue, takes the wind out of the sails enough that we have this equilibrium, which is not that the peace accords are being implemented. We have that kind of as a more stable equilibrium, and I think that's really concerning.
I wanted to turn a little bit towards the protests in other countries.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned that we haven't talked about so much is that some of these protests were about corruption, about the implication of Odebrecht, which is this multinational Brazilian corruption machine. It's actually a building company, construction firm, but has been involved in corruption scandals throughout the region. Being involved in Colombia, I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about the corruption scandal involving Odebrecht in Colombia, and how protests about corruption have affected other countries in the region.
Let me give it my best shot. I think the Odebrecht scandal has been a really interesting kind of phenomenon in Latin America. I think just to so what I study overall is the rule of law. I look at how I've done a lot of work thinking about the new constitutions of Latin America, kind of after the dictatorships. The move in Latin America was, if we pass pretty enough laws, right? If we pass good enough legislation, that's really going to do a lot of the work at getting us to the societies that we want. I think in a lot of ways that hasn't come to fruition. But one thing that we do have now is judiciaries that are capable of prosecuting corruption, right? So everybody knows that Latin America has been corrupt for a very long time, but kind of the basic practices of how you do business often entail greasing the wheels with a little bit of money, right? Which is essentially kind of the overarching complaint against Odebrecht is that in order to secure themselves contracts, they in some ways are channeling money in to the individuals that will give them those contracts, right? From the middle to the top layers of the political establishment. But I think 20 years ago you wouldn't have had that making news, right? But what you've had because of this move to strengthen judiciaries is a judiciary that's newly capable of carrying out investigations and prosecutions into this corruption. What you don't have are political systems that are capable of reining in that tool, right? So when that tool is put in the hands of, for example, which you could talk much more about, right? So I think, as we see in Brazil, when that's wielded by the right against leftist presidents, for example, you have a politicization of that stronger judicial tool, if that makes sense. So I think we have, it's kind of, the judiciary in some ways has been empowered, but the kind of big thing that you need for judiciaries to work the way they're supposed to is that they're supposed to be independent, right? And because we don't have judicial independence assured, and we have executives using these investigations for their own political ends, we have a real perversion of what it was thought that anti-corruption legislation would do. So I think I paint it in broad strokes. In terms of Colombia, it actually hasn't been as big a story in Colombia as in other countries. I'm not familiar with the details exactly of how it's played out, and I think the bigger, to me, it's a side story in Colombia. I mean, you have if we're talking about corruption in Colombia, people are still going back to, actually, Claudia Lopezs, who's currently the mayor, wrote a book called Y Refundaron la Patria, which means they refounded the country. And it's about how her kind of organization proved that 35% of Colombian senators had campaigns that had been funded by paramilitaries, right? So when we think about corruption in Colombia, we're still thinking about the near total control of the political process by the paramilitaries, and that's still, I think, much more politically relevant. Odebrecht's interesting insofar that it's reverberated throughout different countries in Latin America, but I think it's still the sideshow, and still receives really second billing to the larger issues of, I mean, we should paying a lot of attention to paramilitary corruption, right? Paramilitary corruption means not only are they funding those campaigns, but they're credibly calling the shots for what's happening in them. So I'm sure you could talk more in depth about Odebrecht and other, I'm not to put you on the spot, but in other countries.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, Odebrecht
Yeah.
is a sort of an amazing phenomenon, right? And it's this company in Brazil which has its own sort of pervasive problems with official corruption, especially as it relates to government contracts, and I mean, it's had massive effects throughout the region, right? It contributed to bringing down the Peruvian president, and has been caught up in innumerable scandals around the region. Like every time a corruption scandal pops up,
there's Odebrecht.
Odebrecht is involved, right? Like it's
Yep.
just like they're there again, right? It's like the Zelig of Latin American corruption. Literally, it's everywhere, and they always found a way to pop up places. They apparently perfected their official corruption techniques in Brazil, which is a pretty competitive marketplace for that. I wanted though to shift focus a little bit to protests as they relate to violence, right? So that's another area where there's international resonance with regards to protests, especially in the context of Mexico, where there have been a lot of protests in recent years about the country's drug war that's left tens of thousands of people dead. And so one of the things you talked about was, some of these protests were connected to dissatisfaction with the peace process, with the assassinations of civic leaders, especially in rural areas, and how that helped mobilize people in Bogota. How do these dynamics play out in Mexico, right? Are people mobilizing when they mobilize about violence for similar reasons, or are there different things that are pushing anti-violence mobilizations in Mexico?
So I think in Mexico, so again, we have about, I think the numbers aren't great, but we have over 60,000 people that have been disappeared in Mexico by the Mexican state's own account since 2006, and somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people that have been killed, right? So we're talking really, so that's actually the same number of homicides that happened during the entire Colombian conflict. So I think we have unprecedented levels of violence in Mexico. For a long time, you had the government having this kind of, was their version of what was happening is that if people were killed es porque estaban en algo, it's because they were involved in something nefarious and they essentially deserved what was coming for them. So in 2011, we finally have that being challenged. A guy named Javier Sicilia, who's a poet and political commentator, his upper class, light-skinned son, who was a medical student and an athlete, is killed, right? And so when he is killed, it kind of breaks something in Mexico, and they say, this discourse you have that estaban en algo, that they were involved in something, that is not true for Javier Sicilia's son, Juan Cecilia, and it wasn't true for my son, right? It wasn't true for what we see happening throughout Mexico. So over 100,000 people converge upon the main square in Mexico in 2011 and form something called the Movement for Peace with Justice and Dignity. So I think that's the seed of response to violence that we see in Mexico starting in 2011. Since then, Mexico, unlike Colombia, is not a centralized country. We have smaller victims collectives, I would call them, I'd say them in at least half of the Mexican territories. We have smaller civic organizations that have popped up that are trying to push for investigations and push for different policies in all of the Mexican states that are affected by violence, which is, I'd say, roughly half of them. So you don't have, again, we have this wave of violence, which does remind me in many ways of the Colombian protests that we just saw, kind of this immediate outpouring of something's really wrong, we want to take to the streets. In terms of how that's trickled down, I think we have sustained protests in Mexico. We had another huge wave of protests against violence after the disappearance of the 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College on, if I'm not wrong, September 26, 2014, right? This is if you've heard anything about human rights in Mexico, you've probably heard about this story. This is students who were on their way to Mexico City to a protest, commandeered several buses, and then they were surrounded by and shot on by municipal police, and then they were disappeared after that. Kind of their fate remains unknown. That really ignited, again, these are 43, what's undisputed about what happened in that case is these were 43 unarmed students, right? And they were disappeared, and we've never known what happened to them. There was large-scale protests after that. We had arguably, again, 200,000 people that came out to the Zócalo, to the main plaza. It spawned mirror protests throughout the world, and I really thought at the time I was there, I thought it really was a game changer, right? I thought it was really going to change not only what was happening inside of Mexico, but that there would really be a high international cost, and I think essentially, I think I was wrong. I think it hasn't. What Peña Nieto learned after that, the president then, was that he didn't really have to change what they had done, right? He met with Obama, I should say, 3 months after that happened, and by all accounts, Obama did not raise the issue. It was a trade-focused meeting, and Obama didn't raise the issue in that meeting. So I think, I think the dynamics have been, people are upset. There was an outpouring of support in 2011 and again in 2014, but we haven't seen anything like that since. You have kind of well-established, smaller organizations, largely of family members, of families of people who've been disappeared, that are waging a courageous battle against impunity and trying to change things. My book about that is almost done. To plug it, it will be called Bootstrap Justice: The Search for Mexico's Disappeared. But I think kind of overall we have these, again, two outcroppings of big protests and then a lot of smaller protests which are really rooted in organizations.
We invite you to attend other Marxe events. Announcements will be sent via listserv. And I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today and encourage you to continue attending Marxe Global Insights events. Thank you very much.